Remember the last time you were in a productive flow. You got sucked into the work and hours flew by effortlessly in what felt like minutes. You didn't need self-discipline or enormous willpower. You were just doing it without any feeling of sacrifice. In fact, it was the opposite. It felt enjoyable and you wanted to do more and more. You've experienced it before, so you know such a state is possible. But the problem is, on the rare days it does happen, it seems to appear randomly, and it usually doesn't last very long. On all the other days, productivity feels like something you have to force yourself into. Something that requires discipline. Sometimes even the simplest tasks can require days of fighting yourself before you finally begin. And even then, you do it with pressure, tension, and resistance. The good news is that flow state is not random. It can be scientifically explained and therefore controlled, but that doesn't mean it has to be complicated. In fact, it becomes effortless the moment it clicks what's actually happening inside your brain. It's like trying to solve a Rubik's Cube for the first time. At first, it can feel almost impossible, but once you understand a few basic patterns, even kids can solve it in seconds again and again. The first step toward activating flow state on command is recognizing the two fundamental forces that need to be aligned for flow to happen. Once these two forces are aligned, you automatically stop playing the game of life and productivity on hard mode and enter effortless flow state. I call them fundamental forces because until these two forces are taken care of, no productivity tip, system, or mindset advice will stand a chance. Because these two forces don't just determine whether you're able to stay in flow state, they also determine whether you're able to begin a task in the first place. And I'm saying this because my suspicion is that in the past, you've already seen a bunch of productivity advice that sounded great at first, but all it really gave you was more work to do, while your core problem was not being able to begin working in the first place. The first fundamental force is motivation. Motivation is directly linked to a chemical in your brain called dopamine. And science tells us that if dopamine levels in your brain are low, you will not feel motivated to do anything. In cases of extremely low dopamine, you may not even eat, despite being hungry. But unless you're addicted to some of the strongest drugs that damage the dopamine system, the motivational side of flow state is usually solvable within a day or two. But before we go there, let's quickly mention the second fundamental force that affects flow state: mental and emotional resistance. Resistance comes in the form of the uncomfortable feeling you get when it's time to begin a certain task. As you'll discover shortly, this uncomfortable feeling mostly comes from irrational fears that make the task feel much harder than it really is. But for now, let's think of mental resistance as an invisible prison cell that blocks you from doing the things you know you should do, or even want to do. The formula for getting into flow state is simple. Motivation has to be stronger than mental resistance, which means you don't need to become a different person. You don't need to build heroic discipline. You just need to adjust both sides of the equation just enough that action starts feeling genuinely doable. Anything you do or don't do in life depends on this equation. For example, if I offered you $1 million to be fully productive for the rest of today, you suddenly wouldn't feel tired, lazy, lethargic, or whatever reason you normally give for procrastinating. Just the opposite. You would spend the day excited and enjoying the process. $1 million is massive external motivation, and it comes with a lot of dopamine. So the flow formula would shift in your favor. You might think this example is trivial because such strong external motivation is unrealistic. So let me ask you a question. When you brushed your teeth this morning, or did something similarly good for yourself, did you do it because you felt enormous motivation? Or were you able to do it simply because the mental resistance was so minor that it didn't require much motivation to overcome? So the real question is, if most of the time you're not in flow state, why is your motivation usually lower than your resistance? The answer is self-sabotage. I say self-sabotage because flow state is something we are born with. Just look at children and how immersed they become in whatever they do. When they want to do something, they go for it. They don't overthink. They don't care if they do it perfectly. And they certainly don't fear failure. You might say that a child's play is different from everyday adult responsibilities. And on the surface, that may be true. But in the context of flow state, it doesn't matter. After all, adults struggle to get into flow even with things they genuinely want to do. Working on their passion project, building a healthy body, improving their relationship with themselves or with others. The thing is, as our brain develops, we also develop the ability to sabotage our own flow state, and we unknowingly do it on both sides of the equation. We crash our dopamine levels, and with them, our internal motivation, but we also create unnecessary resistance. So let's first look at a practical example of sabotaging motivation. You know that feeling when you're supposed to start working on a task, but you say to yourself, "I'll just watch one more YouTube video and then I'll begin." Or, "Let me check social media real quick and then I'll start." What's happening in that moment is your brain is craving more dopamine, so the formula can shift in favor of action. When you watch a video, your dopamine spikes and you might feel better, maybe even motivated. But the moment you stop watching or scrolling, your dopamine crashes below the level you started with, and now you're even less likely to enter productive flow. You know what follows next? You reach for another quick fix, only for your motivation to crash again later. And this is how the dopamine roller coaster keeps you trapped, either high on a quick fix or miserable and craving another one. And while you're stuck there, productive flow never stands a chance. The only time you might temporarily escape this cycle is when something external forces you to act, like the pressure of a deadline, because a deadline creates direct consequences. And consequences spike your motivation enough to temporarily overpower resistance. In those moments, you might pull an all-nighter and do more in one night than you normally do in 2 weeks. But when the pressure is gone, you fall right back onto the roller coaster until the next deadline appears. Meanwhile, weeks and months disappear in stagnation. Not because you willingly choose to waste your time and potential, but because external pressure is the only thing that reliably kicks you into action. And when it comes to the goals that matter most to you, nobody is coming to set the deadline for you. So the first step toward consistent flow state is getting off the dopamine roller coaster. And if you're worried right now that this means quitting your quick fixes and vices, let me assure you right away, that's not needed. Cutting things you enjoy out of your life would require a lot of willpower and discipline. And even if you were able to do it, it would only remove self-sabotage on the motivation side of the flow formula. So, before I propose a solution for the motivation problem, let's quickly look at how we sabotage ourselves on the other side of the flow formula, by creating resistance that makes productive tasks feel unnecessarily hard. Imagine I put a narrow plank over a small stream. If you cross it, you get $1 million. Easy, right? Motivation is high and the task is easy. Walk the plank. You would run over it. But now imagine I tell you, yes, you're getting $1 million. But you should also know the water is full of deadly snakes. If you slip from the plank, you will most likely die. Now, even the first step would feel impossible, despite the huge motivation, because what happened? Your mental and emotional resistance just skyrocketed, and the fear of dying overpowered your strong motivation to get the $1 million. And here's where self-sabotage comes in. Because I lied to you, there are no snakes in the water. In fact, if you happen to slip from the plank, you can simply go back to the start and try again. And the same way I lied to you about the snakes, your mind is lying to you about the dangers of doing something productive for your goals. It produces all sorts of scary, hypothetical scenarios. It makes you think twice about whether taking action is really what you need to do. It makes you wonder if there's a better way to do it. Or it suggests you should rest now and begin tomorrow, when your performance will be better and you'll be less likely to make mistakes. But most of what your mind is saying is just useless overthinking that prevents you from beginning. You've experienced this before. You dreaded a task for days, only to find out it wasn't nearly as bad or uncomfortable as your mind made it seem. And this brings us to the part most people get wrong about resistance and flow state, the part that keeps them trapped for years. And it certainly kept me stuck in stagnation and missed opportunities for far too long. See, most productivity advice essentially tells you to find a way to push through resistance, to toughen up, get more disciplined, ignore your feelings, and just do it. But doing that is the equivalent of pushing on the gas pedal while your brakes are clamped at the same time. It's playing the game of life on hard mode. You might move a bit, but it's only a matter of time before you give up or burn out. The solution is not to add more gas. The solution is to release the brakes. And to release the mental brakes, You only need to understand one tiny piece of brain science. All emotions we feel before a task are caused by our thoughts, whether conscious or subconscious. If you think about how long the task is going to take, you might feel discouraged. If you think about past failure, you might feel fear of it happening again. If you obsess about completing the task to some perfect standard, you might feel overwhelmed. All these emotions then pile up into one big wall of discomfort. But that wall is built thought by thought. So the fewer thoughts there are, the fewer emotions we feel, including the uncomfortable emotions that eventually hold us back from action. So, to reduce resistance and turn the flow formula in our favor, we should not try to push through emotional discomfort, because that only creates more friction. Instead, we should reduce the number of thoughts causing these emotions in the first place. So, there is no resistance left to push through. When there is no resistance, we suddenly don't need enormous motivation anymore, and productive action starts flowing naturally. You suddenly don't need to fight your mind to begin everything you know you want or should do. It starts feeling natural to follow through on your plans with the same ease you brush your teeth in the morning. And from the outside, it might look like you've developed crazy self-discipline or become an entirely new person. But in reality, you've just learned how to release the invisible brakes that have been holding your potential back for years. Maybe you know someone who appears less capable than you, maybe even less intelligent, and yet they are miles ahead of you in terms of actual results. I don't know you personally, but if you experience overthinking, a racing mind, and constant internal dialogue, your mind is probably blocking your flow almost all the time, and it will stay that way until you learn to calm it down. Now that you know what you're dealing with and where flow state actually comes from, the only question that remains is, how do you stabilize your motivation and calm your mind? And more importantly, how do you do it without turning it into another productivity system, routine, or habit you end up procrastinating on?